Welcome to MacDonald's podcast, Nature Positive, The Inside Story. In this podcast series, our host Julia Baker will be talking to industry leaders and experts about nature-related policy, advisory, law, and much more. In today's episode, Julia sits down with Phoebe Tucker to discuss GFI's newly published B&G roadmap and the latest updates on nature markets. Don't forget to subscribe and, most importantly, enjoy this episode.
Phoebe, welcome to our podcast, Nature Positive, The Inside Story. It's lovely to have you here.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
What do you do for a job?
So what I do for a job, I focus on how to unlock private finance for nature. And that is a broad kind of mission, but I focus particularly on the role of nature markets. So essentially what happens when we approach nature and all the services that it provides us, specifically ecosystem services, and look at that through a market lens. So if we were to build in the cost of nature and the benefits that it gives us into everyday business decision making, and then introduce a market-based mechanism such as trading between sellers and buyers, what does that look like? And how can we build markets that really work for nature and not shift money around, basically?
December 2021, you moved from the banking sector. I mean, it was kind of banking in England. And then you moved to this job that you got with the Green Finance Industry Institute. Why did you move?
Good question. I moved because I felt that I had taken a lot from my job in a core high street bank. At the same time, I was volunteering at a sustainability employee-led network that a couple of friends of mine started. And I ended up enjoying that more than my day job. So it was the way. Yeah, it's always the way, it's kind of this side of desk thing, working on kind of, looking at bank products through a green lens and engaging employees to be more empowered to kind of speak up within their teams about what they can do. And, upskilling and like teaching about, sometimes it was just having fun learning about things like blue carbon. But 3 years in, I kind of decided the writing's on the wall. I really need to shift to a job with sustainability at its core. And reflecting further on that, because sustainability is so broad, I realized that I was quite frustrated with the fact that banks in general and the finance sector were focused a lot on the net zero agenda. And there was a lot of talk about decarbonizing and, reaching net zero and setting goals. But I was thinking, by 2050, if we meet those carbon goals, but our waterways are in terrible shape and our pollinator species are all decimated, all that kind of other stuff, people call it other stuff that nature provides us.
Yeah.
What happens if that's not there? So I started interviewing at different organizations, and in the interview with Green Finance Institute, it wasn't specifically for a nature role. They were sort of looking for people to join their teams overall. They asked me, what really interests you in the sustainability agenda? And I said exactly what I've just said. I said, if you've got anything to do with nature, put me on it. And my current line manager, my current boss, was in that meeting, and she said, we've just got funding for a nature associate.
Isn't that brilliant timing?
Yeah, really brilliant.
I just think, sometimes when that timing happens, you're like, right, this is actually something, and you've really got to see it. And you're so right. I think it's also, it can be quite difficult when you're just starting up your career, you've already got a job. To take such a pivot is actually quite a brave move.
Well, I was really, really excited. I think, I was quite nervous, kind of leaving the banking world and joining this organization.
Traditional career.
Yeah, traditional career. And, working for a much smaller company that was still very much plugged into the banking sector and my core interests of finance and markets. But, it's just such a great team at GFI and a great culture. And I, work with people every day that really believe in what they're doing and get to kind of, we definitely support each other. So quite a move. I mean, there were people at my previous job that were really passionate, obviously, but it's great when you're all kind of working towards the same thing and you're all excited to learn.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So the Green Finance Institute this August published a roadmap. Now, it published a roadmap about biodiversity net gain, and we're going to abbreviate that to BNG. So, but it was really focused on biodiversity markets, and it looked at all the challenges with the biodiversity net gain markets, and it produced this roadmap to take action. And I have to say, it was a breath of fresh air. And it really made me realise, actually, that this was the first time, really, that someone had looked in detail about the market side of biodiversity net gain. They've got mandatory net gain. Because before all of that, I mean, of course, there was discussion about biodiversity net gain, but it was a lot about biodiversity metrics, about how do we get to development following the mitigation hierarchy, producing more wildlife-rich habitats. There was some talk about biodiversity markets, but not to the level that you went into. What was the original intention behind that?
Well, we have a great network of different stakeholders, both on the supply and the demand side, and and the finance sector also. And so we were hearing quite a lot of concern about, yes, the BNG is an amazing opportunity. We're really excited about it, but we also see that there are some things that in the design of this market structure, we think there are serious gaps that could really minimise the potential of it. So we decided to first come up with a briefing letter, a briefing note, really. And that was a really quick kind of 7-page summary of the high priorities for government. And we put that out on the 12th of February when Biodiversity Net Gain was made mandatory for major developers. And then, beyond that, we realized that there was real value in digging even deeper into the things that maybe weren't kind of the pressing, urgent priorities that we covered in the briefing note, but also, the things that longer term need to be sorted out. And so we realized that there was real value in almost doing a kind of a diagnostic report, if I'm being honest. It kind of reads like that with, the number of challenges it details. There was real value for both government and for industry to have that consistent view in one place that reflects multiple stakeholders' views. So we really wanted to influence government. Yeah,
because it's an interesting mix. So what's your definition of the biodiversity net gain market?
It's a good question. It's really the recognition of how gains can be delivered by different parties. So,
right.
Thinking about supply of biodiversity net gain, that can happen with developers on site. They can build, habitats into their developments, into their plans, but also they can pay for farmers, landowners and wildlife trusts to deliver that nearby. So it kind of represents the transfer of liability for those long-term habitat outcomes to be delivered. So you're buying a unit in BNG terms, but actually you're paying for the delivery of a habitat over 30 years.
And when you looked at and started unpacking, I know you undertook a series of interviews and all the literature review, and you interviewed so many people. What was your greatest challenge to actually, okay, we've got the roadmap, let's go deeper, let's really unpack this. When you were going through that roadmap, what was your challenge?
I think it was really balancing views, and because BNG is such a new space. I know we've been building it for like 10 years, and I say we, government and the market have been working up to this for over 10 years, actually. But when you put a market lens on something, there's a lot of mistrust, I'd say, and a lot of people who have quite strong opinions about the way things should be done, or other people's practices, other organizations, and why are they in the market? Why are they providing this service? And how are they doing it? And so I kept on hearing quite critical views of all these different components and all these different groups. And people having strong views, but I really had to work on tempering that and hearing the other side. And in this space, there are so many examples of where one person might have a really critical view about something, but then you'll go talk to another person and they'll explain, actually, there's a really good reason for why that's happening the way it is, and it's not perfect. But don't
knock it out.
Don't knock it out, and work with people instead of kind of assuming the worst.
But I think you're right, actually, because I think when mandatory net gain came in on the 12th, it was so different. I mean, we were all in the motorway of biodiversity net gain, but mandatory net gain was so different. And I certainly didn't anticipate just how different it would be. We had all these, we had the statutory biodiversity metric, that was different. We had the biodiversity gain hierarchy, all of these quite technical requirements to meet to deliver biodiversity net gain. And then we actually had what is now a formalized market, because before it was, kind of like, individual transactions or, whatever that might be. So I think you're right. I think it's important to recognize how new that was, even though there had been a long build up in the, in the voluntary space for biodiversity net gain. But I also think you're right. It's people, and, myself included, there's so much that rests on biodiversity net gain because it is such a turning point and a milestone that we do need to come together and get it right. But it does divide opinions.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's the unexpected value of the roadmap, because we set out thinking, we're going to be really helpful to government and really synthesize views from over 100 different market stakeholders, really try and help and be solutions led as well, and recognize where industry can play a bigger role alongside government. But the unexpected benefit of the roadmap from where we're sitting is that actually it does put people on a common understanding of what it is. So you as a farmer, for example, might think the challenge is X, but then you build in, the wider picture and how all these other challenges intersect. And then all of a sudden you're talking to your local planning authority or your responsible body in a different way. And you kind of understand why they might, be operating the way they're operating. And so I think it was just really good for clarifying what's out there and what the challenges are, as well as the potential solutions.
And I think you capture that with a market lens, that we don't capture that from a sort of biodiversity net gain metric lens, because the market is all about, what people believe and how they behave and, those kind of market forces. Obviously, there's the economics behind it. But from, a metric, a biodiversity point of view, it's skills, it's competencies, it's looking at the metric rather than are people trusting in investing in that market?
Yeah, there has to be trust, or there has to be enough transparency that, not even trust in other people, but trust in the governance of the system to really understand, there are enough checks and balances. I can get on and do what I'm doing with confidence. But I also know that, there is enough transparency and certainty to operate with other people.
Yeah.
You can't just do it all yourself. You have to put your faith in the system a bit.
And I know just how hard you worked on that. I mean, we had a couple of sessions and you were so dedicated and devoted, and it really is, it's a fantastic piece of work. But I was just wondering, where did that come from you? I mean, there was, obviously the importance that you recognised, and the Green Finance Institute, kind of put their, if you like, their company behind it. But from your kind of personal drive?
I think I was really excited to work on a market with a compliance lens.
Right.
And thinking about, and there were numbers put out in the early days before B&G was made mandatory about what kind of volumes of finance could be flowing now that it's got this kind of mandatory scope. And so I thought, this is brilliant, because, nature traditionally has not been as valued as other priorities within businesses and within sectors. So what happens if you just make it a requirement? And and since then I've reflected on the benefits of both, where you can it's a requirement, but it's not just developers having to do this. It's actually an opportunity for them. So it's the balance of kind of making a market compliance based, but also building in the opportunities for everyone. So I think, compared to other things where the revenue models just aren't as developed, B&G was almost like a supercharged moment to really get money through fast, but have everyone working together in a collaborative way.
And I think also you really did, and when we were talking about it, it was like the gap to fill. No one was having this conversation really to that level, and this was actually, that kind of important missing piece.
Yeah, I think I do think that it's really surprising that we could fill that role, because actually B&G, there's so many people working on it, and I was so privileged actually to draw on so many conversations with people who were working on this for so long. So really we almost see our role there as like convening all the great thinking out there, and providing, as I said, that consistent kind of understanding.
but filling that gap.
But filling that gap, surprisingly.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it was really, really great to do.
So your roadmap has 4 pillars: market, central governance, supply side, and demand side.
Metric. Yeah.
Metric. Yeah. No, that's it. Yeah, metric. So metric, central government, demand, and supply side. Yeah. Gosh, how could I forget the metric?
Oh, good.
But was there a pivotal moment when you thought those are the 4 pillars? Was there like that was it, or did it kind of just come out?
Yeah, I think when it came about when we were finishing up with the initial briefing note, actually, because we had 2 workshops with around 30 stakeholders, and everyone came together to kind of talk about the near term, medium term, and long term priorities that they would like to see addressed.
Right.
But then we looked at that, and it was a kind of a messy grid of 3 columns, but there was a lot there, and we thought, actually, let's provide a different lens to this, still keeping that kind of urgency, short term, medium term, long term view, but also building in kind of how these changes interlink and how actually these changes might be perceived as the burden or the responsibility of not the burden or responsibility, the most felt by certain actors within the market. So with the metric, it's metric users, and that is a very, very broad bucket, because we know that kind of a farmer can open it up, a developer, LPAs, responsible bodies, government, even people just interested in what it could do. You could be a community-led organization, and then thinking about, okay, so how does this metric work? But then you open it up and it's so overwhelming initially, and then you tap into kind of all the work that's been done for it. And so, we thought that the metric itself, people had some strong views about what it should be. So we thought, okay, great, that metric is one. And then, the rest were quite natural as well. We saw that central governance, there were a lot of challenges felt by local planning authorities and responsible bodies. Supply side, that's, again, such a broad bucket. And then the demand side was really, it was really key to build that into, because without developers, none of this, it's a demand-driven model.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Without developers and their views, we're not going to get there.
Yeah. It's always, I always think it's interesting, isn't it, when you've got such a big topic and you're filling in this gap about markets for biodiversity net gain, it's incredibly important to structure it that people can access what you're talking about, because it was so comprehensive what you were doing. And I really like those 4 pillars. I think they speak really well. And I think they're a big enough bucket, but you've captured the theme of what's really important, without going kind of too broad, if you like.
Yeah, not going too broad was a challenge, especially with the way we work, where we really want to pursue everything to make sure we really understand what we're talking about, and we're really reflecting. We don't want to kind of come in and develop a high level understanding and then just kind of, skim along the top of what are the surface issues. It's important to really follow the lead and go deep. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's do that then. So let's start with the biodiversity metric. So this is the statutory biodiversity metric. It is an Excel tool, but what it does, it uses data on habitats. So the ecologist, competent ecologist, will go out and survey habitats, and they put the data in terms of metric, in terms of the habitat type, the area, the condition, strategic significance, and the metric automatically calculate what's called habitat units. And you calculate your total habitat units for your baseline, and you've got to get 10% at the end of your development. And the metric looks at different types of units. So I love it from an ecology point of view, because it's been a habitat-based approach. We've come from this place of protected species and, following the mitigation hierarchy, but having to really think about, well, how do those individual species fit together? But when you're thinking about those habitats, it was always the philosophy of, build us and they will come. What could be a really good proxy indicator for biodiversity net gain, and it is just a proxy. And the metric is one tool in the toolkit to design biodiversity net gain, but it is about habitats. So from a biodiversity point of view, there's always going to be an inherent limitation where you try to put a proxy figure on biodiversity. Given that, and given that it's one tool in the toolkit to design net gain, there's a lot of opinions. A lot of people have opinions about whether it's right or not from a biodiversity point of view, but also it's the best out there that we have, quite frankly. from a market point of view, I was quite interested that you chose the metric because it's inherently a technical biodiversity tool, but I guess it's that transaction.
Yeah,
Right.
definitely. You need to quantify what you're selling to really, really dig deep into outcomes. And as you said, the metric is a proxy, and it's always going to have its limitations and trade-offs. And especially the wider you go in terms of what you're measuring and what you're capturing, it's a huge accomplishment to design a metric that serves all of England's terrestrial habitats. So I really enjoyed learning about that. But from a market perspective, are you paying for what exactly are you paying for? Are you paying for someone to come and install habitats, in which case that's activities based, or are you trying to incentivize them to really deliver uplift over the longer term? And the metric,
when you say uplift, what do you mean?
So habitat restoration or creation. So you could start with a low distinctiveness habitat and build and do the
low value, but you restore to it habitats to its former glory.
Former glory, or you turn the habitat into something completely different if the conditions are right. And that's why
so historical restoration of heathland or something like that.
Exactly. And so the metric it was really great getting to know the metric and how it does that with kind of because ultimately it gives you a number.
Yeah.
And there's a risk always that people will try and up the number as much as possible in the most unsustainable way in order to get financial gains. So how does the metric temper that behavior and build in risk? It has difficulty to create multipliers. It has a time to condition multiplier. It has different risk multipliers that adjust according to if you're uplifting, if you're improving an existing habitat's condition, or if you're kind of creating it from scratch. So it's been interesting to know, okay, how the metric is so crucial to market behavior, because we need to know exactly what we're selling. We need to have a number and a measure of impact and compensation, and that measure needs to be consistent. But beyond that, beyond just the basic function of a market, how are you incentivizing good behavior? And the metric builds into that as well.
Yeah, but it's the people who use the metric. So the metric is, you're right, it's packed full of incentives and it's packed full of penalties, and it is first line of defense. If you really take down that very high value habitat, to get to net gain, it really packs in all those contingencies, you're right. But if you restore habitats to its former glory, there's all these incentives, but it's down to the person who uses it.
Yeah. And also the person who is checking that work as well. Yeah. And so hopefully you want to believe that that if there is a complete cowboy out there that's just looking for the biggest number that they can generate, there will be someone on the other end, for example, in the responsible body team or in the local planning authority.
Yes.
And they're saying, you're trying to plant forests on bogs or something ridiculous like that. Yeah. What are you doing?
Let's check it.
Yeah.
So what was the one in your roadmap about the metric? What is, out of everything that you found, what is one point that you would like to make? What is that one headline?
I think it is that there is no such thing as a perfect biodiversity metric. And I think it needs to be iterative. I think that, it's always going to use proxies. There's always going to be limitations. I think as long as we are working towards making it better and drawing on ecological data, because I think the next 5 years in particular, next 3 years, where we get the statutory review will be very interesting, because I know there are a lot of people out there looking at exactly what the metric incentivizes and what outcomes there are, and collecting underlying ecological data as well. So how can we strengthen that proxy between habitat and biodiversity?
Yes.
Is it introducing measures of connectivity? Is it factoring in soil type? Like soil, I learned that soil actually has such a key part in
huge.
Yeah, drawing biodiversity to a habitat. And so it's possible to build that in, but we have to accept that the metric is going to need to be updated as we go, and hopefully we as an industry, we as a market can move with it.
Central governance, that was your second pillar. What do you mean by that?
Central governance, so who is in the middle between the buyer and the seller at a basic level? Who is in the middle at the buyer and the seller, making sure that market rules are being followed, that biodiversity, that the metric calculations are correct, for example, that transactions are being set up well, that they're following local and national policy. So at the very basic level, it's making sure things are running as intended.
When you say market rules, the market's not regulated.
Well, exactly. I mean,
So
I think...
what rules do you mean?
So I think it really touches on what I reflected on while we were developing the roadmap. Central governance is a bit of a misnomer in a way, because at the very top level, there are rules set by Natural England and DEFRA. Like, a basic one will be you have to use the statutory biodiversity metric.
Yes,
that's an example.
Okay, so there's legal requirements to
legal
meet.
requirements,
Right,
yes,
okay.
at the top level.
But the market is completely unregulated.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
you go on LinkedIn, who's not selling habitat units?
Exactly, and I think most of the challenges, if not all of the challenges within that pillar, are linked to local planning authorities and responsible bodies. They are the de facto market regulators in their own space. Definitely LPAs, especially because they're checking the work of developers.
Yes.
But really, people refer to the biodiversity net gain market as a national market. I realised, and I think everyone realised up to a point after implementation, that what you've got is actually something like 365 micro markets. I say 365 with an asterisk, because actually it was even a struggle to get a consistent answer on how many local planning authorities there are in England. I kept on asking, and some people said, okay, there's 325, and then another person would say there's 370. And so we tried to check our facts and figures, and it was...
They do change.
Yeah, exactly. So people are working from different data sets.
Right.
But every single local planning authority has their own local plan.
Yeah.
They have their own features of the planning system that, for example, asks for different information at different points. Section 106 agreements is a big one, the local land charge that is meant to legally secure the habitats. There are all these different conditions that LPAs could come out with. And then on top of that, you've got trading rules. So, for example, I know that some local planning authorities have been found to refuse cross-border sales, to say, we know that there's units here, we are going to refuse this border sale, even though the spatial risk multiplier disincentivizes you. We are actually going to say that's not good, and we
want it in their patch.
We want it on our patch or nothing at all.
Fair enough.
Yeah, but it's sort of...
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think, and what you drew out from the roadmap is that I don't think people had said local planning authorities are actually so much of the influence that they have in the B&G market, because it is planning policy, compliance. So it's been talked about in a legal compliance lens rather than really influencing the market. And some local planning authorities have set themselves up as habitat banks. Yeah. So they're actually interested in that supply-demand discussion while also having that influence on the market.
Yeah, and that's an example of a kind of a concern that people have, to say, is there a possibility of insider trading here? How much are conflicts of interest managed? Because, I know why. I've spoken to LPAs who have set up their own habitat banks, and they say, and there's actually, you do...
There's some brilliant ones.
Brilliant.
And they filled a gap.
And they do fill a gap.
Yeah.
And they say we don't want to slow down development because we have our housing targets. We want to make sure we're ready.
There was no one there.
And also even if there are people, they are very concerned with signing 30-year Section 106 agreements in exchange for a monitoring fee. Yes, if they're serving the off-site market in that way, they're signing an S106 agreement, they're receiving a monitoring fee. But actually, there's such inconsistency with how monitoring fees are calculated, and they're thinking, by signing on the dotted line, am I going to bankrupt my council in year 25 when we don't have enough money to carry out monitoring? And that's an extreme example, but they basically want to make sure that they're calculating the finances correctly, that they're having enough legal assurances. And they say, we feel more comfortable just for now, doing a couple of pilots ourselves and then get things up and running. And then we can accept third parties like estate managers and farmers.
You've just raised something really important. And I think it's only when you start to really go through the process, because there was so much about, well, how much does this biodiversity unit cost for a developer? No one really said, well, how much should and there was discussion about it, but how much does a local planning authority charge for monitoring over 30 years? Yeah. And you're right, actually, that's so important for the actual local planning authority to say, well, we need to get that cost right over 30 years. Exactly. And really bring it home. Do you think the market should be regulated for biodiversity net gain?
I think definitely more regulation. I think we need better data feeds. I think we should have more transparency. And I think that there should be some mechanism to check things as they're going. I mean, I don't want to wait in 10 years down the line and hear about this massive scandal because there were, core challenges within the governance structure that just meant things slipped through the net. And it could be that because it is a new market and there's only, you learn so much from, the reality of how things are going, but you need, I think, an oversight that kind of captures things as they're happening rather than, all the half the habitats are wiped out because of this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And do you have a sense of what's more effective? Because there's standards for markets. I know the British Standard Institute is working on various nature market standards versus regulation. And I always think it's quite an interesting one. Again, it's like, the behaviour, standards relate to performance and versus regulation. I've got to toe the line here. Do you have a sense of what would be?
I do think that third-party verification is preferable. I think that you can have as many standards as you like, but you've
got to have that.
You've got to have that. And taking learnings from kind of voluntary carbon, people have got this kind of idea of a triangle set up in your mind. You've got the person setting the rules, you've got the person carrying out the activity according to the rules, and then you've got the third person or the third organisation who's coming in and checking that the rules are being followed.
Right.
And you need to keep those roles separate to an extent to make sure that there are conflicts of interest being effectively avoided. So I think standards and clarity and getting best practices communicated right across the board, along with minimum standards, all very useful.
So it's like a picture of everything.
Yeah, but I think I would say that, having regulatory oversight would be good.
Yeah.
Because, it provides more assurance. It needs to be flexible, though, in terms of digging into the challenges. There are questions that arise about enforceability and to what extent do you hold people accountable for? And what kind of administrative burden does that introduce? How much are you going to pursue people to give you over information and pay you money to come and check their work? But could you design the system where it's minimal and it feeds into everything they're doing already?
I think, like the whole... there's so much talk about digital data capture, satellite imagery, things like that, and I think the transparency point, spatial mapping, of B&G sites, whether it's on or off site, is going to be quite key. And I think you're right. I think there's no one silver bullet, but everything has to come together, but that has to be purposeful and intentional. And it kind of feels like we're not quite, I know we're not quite there, but someone hasn't got the reins apart. I mean, your roadmap, you set it out. But it comes back to the who is responsible for what in the market setting. Where do you see that?
So it's not exactly clear, I think.
No, it's not at all.
On who is responsible for what, because you have this idea of kind of what are the penalties for not following the rules correctly. But just a classic example. Just habitats in general and nature, it can be very unpredictable. You can just have a force majeure event like a horrible storm or increased, it could be a chronic climate risk of increased temperatures. And, how do you balance incentivizing people to do the right thing and following the rules to a T, knowing that they could actually be on the hook for something if they're found to not be following the rules. But on the flip side of that, you have to also build in the classic kind of issue of nature being unpredictable and not following a balance sheet or an Excel,
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, isn't it? So from a nature point of view, I'm lucky we've got a brilliant climate resilience team, and they can really tap into climate future prediction data. You're right, there's still a level of uncertainty there, but from a technical industry side, there's a lot of learning that we need to do about that. But I think it's an acceptable level of that 10%. So right back in the day, we might have thought it was woodland, but okay, this is going to be more of a woody, scrubby habitat, but we've still got the 10%, but I think your point comes back to monitoring and enforcement. So even if those things happen, even if we've designed in climate resilience as much as possible, even if we're on track for a 10%, that is very much aligned with that original Biodiversity Net Gain target, who is monitoring and enforcing it?
Yeah. And who's also looking at taking the bird's eye view of everything. So you've got monitors and enforcers, but could the differences in how LPAs and RBs monitor and enforce things, could that cause problems later on down the line? I mean, we've seen examples of international markets where potentially, there's too much regional variability and it's not feeding back into one big picture. And we actually don't know if we are delivering 10% overall.
So does the practical answer come back to, if we get the monitoring fees right, and if we build up those resources and local planning system, and that I really like that triangle that you just said, is that the practical starting point?
I think so. I think that you can't expect people to do a great job for a quarter of what they need to do it. And so, and it's really tough talking about that regional variability. Different organizations will have different cost bases. So you might have, a 75 grand monitoring fee, or you might have 150 grand monitoring fee, depending on who's doing it, where they're doing it, and what they're monitoring. That's quite an extreme example, actually, with those figures. But my point is, people are wondering, why are things being done so differently? Is it going to hamstring us in the future, or is it actually important to build in that variability? I think people are grappling with that question right now.
Yeah, and I think you can have a standardized framework and market setting, but allow for those local, like you say, the local variability.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, supply side. What is supply side, and what is one key headline from your roadmap that you like to get to?
So supply side, basically third-party landholders. So they could be farmers, they could be estate owners, they could be wildlife trusts. We've already talked about local authorities using their own land, even developers, actually. If they work on sites with a lot of potential to deliver, something minor and, with a minimal footprint, but they've got kind of broader habitats that they could play around with, they could actually become sellers. And again, there are some disagreements over to what extent they should be allowed to do that in the market, which was, again, very interesting for me to get into, for us to get into as an organisation.
Just to tap into that, was that because people worried that then the market wouldn't go to, like grassroots conservation organisations?
I think it was more a worry about additionality.
Oh, right.
So you have, for example, solar sites, and you think, okay, so the developer is going to put solar panels on there. They're going to have grassland. That grassland is going to have a little bit of impact on it, but overall, the developer what they would have done anyway is probably let it be and, not treat it with chemicals and not mow it to an inch of its life.
Right.
So you're thinking, okay, the developer has a potential windfall here of kind of £200,000 of biodiversity revenue, even if it's something that small. They could be looking at millions, depending on what the habitat is. Is it fair that they get that? I mean, is that additional? Are we actually seeing additional biodiversity outcomes? Or is it something that was going to happen anyway, and we're just shifting money to people who were fine to begin with, basically?
Yeah. And that is, and that's where I think your roadmap really draws out these really important points, because that's not regulation or compliance. That's what do we value and what do we think success looks like.
Yeah, and I think just an overall point about markets, they can be very dangerous things in economic terms of how do you, in terms of how you align economic incentives and disincentives, where is the money flowing, and could it be just kind of shifting money around in a meaningless way, or towards people who maybe aren't doing as much for nature? That's not to say that developers don't do anything for nature, of course.
No, there's a spectrum.
There's a spectrum.
Yeah. And some people are, there's some really great conservation projects on land owned by developers.
Yeah. But that point around additionality, that's everywhere in nature markets.
Right.
People are very, rightly concerned about that.
Your final pillar was demand. So what is that, just to clarify? And what was the one headline that you want to make for that one?
So demand is, primarily land developers. So they could be home builders. Home builders, for some reason, is held up as the archetype of the demand side for B&G. I think it's quite evocative of us as a nation, with our kind of social and cultural feelings towards kind of house building. So you think of the house builders, but they also could, it's such a wide spectrum. They could be building transport links or energy infrastructure, or
development that needs planning permission.
Anything that needs planning permission through the Town and Country Planning Act. And you'll know more a bit about this than I do. But, and even actually, funnily enough, rural landowners themselves who, for example, a farmer wants to build a barn on their land, they need planning permission. All of a sudden, they've got a requirement for B&G.
Yes, of course.
And that was something that, not everyone liked. This idea of kind of hammering farmers for expanding their farm business infrastructure, that turned a few heads.
Yeah, but it's also,
ultimately, that barn is
biodiversity can add value in that way. So
exactly,
yeah, I know what you mean. So what's the headline from your roadmap?
Well, actually, I think the headline from that particular pillar is we realised that it's not just about developers and kind of putting it down once the planning application is done and the development's built. It's actually longer term, how those habitats look for developments.
Right.
And so then you're bringing in management companies and landscape architects and, even down to kind of real estate agents and homeowners who have, for example, a wildflower habitat by their houses, and it's fenced off and it's protected. But there might be an ongoing service charge for that. And so everything that the developer does at the initial stage, they're setting up that longer term thinking, that longer term structure by which those habitats will be taken care of. So it was a good shift for us to think about, okay, developers need certainty up front, but they're building that into their contracts with everyone and how they sell their houses and how they hire in people to take care of the habitats longer term, because they're not often the ones to do it. So that was interesting, thinking about kind of how the cement sets for development up front.
Yes, and that change of behaviour.
That change of behaviour, exactly.
Yeah, in terms of the contracts.
Yeah.
So thinking about biodiversity net gain markets as a springboard for wider green finance, what do you call, how do you describe green finance?
Green finance, I would say, is, I take this approach of thinking about it through two ways. Number one is financing green. So how do we get money towards the people and the organisations that actually can deliver nature positive outcomes? So it's not just, it's people with influence over land
use. I like that, financing green.
Yeah.
You flip it.
Sorry?
Yeah. You just flip it.
Yeah, exactly. Financing green and getting as much money towards genuine outcomes as possible. But there's also a lens of greening finance. And so that takes a more systemic view of how are we going to transition to an economy that values and invests in nature.
Got you.
So how are banks building in nature-related risks into their balance sheets? How are they reserving capital to account for shocks? Are they following a green taxonomy? And that green taxonomy isn't just about climate change, adaptation and mitigation. It's all about everything else that comes with the environment. So kind of making sure that you're not harming other very valuable.
Right. So where investors put their money in, are they investing in what activities that enhance nature?
Yeah, exactly.
How do they know that?
Well, that's the thing. There's lots of frameworks out there that they could assess on it.
Right.
They could assess through that question. But also, we are developing a UK taxonomy, and there is an EU taxonomy already out there. And
for green finance.
Yeah, for green finance. And it was, I think we're all on a learning journey, and other countries are looking at kind of, let's look at the EU taxonomy. Let's do what they're doing, or let's do something different. And let's think about international operability. So investors that are operating across multiple different countries, how do they know that if they want to really put their money towards something that at least isn't going to harm nature, how are those different standards speaking to each other?
So you're thinking about the investors, and then the money flows down in that way.
Yeah. So it's kind of bottom up and top down.
Yes.
And how economic incentives are aligned at the very top level of governments and policy and just thinking about, for example, subsidies. Is that incentivizing people to take decisions that harm nature, or are we kind of putting that towards, as you say, behavioral change?
Yeah. Where is this heading? Because it's such a fast-moving space, green finance. It's being talked about. There's concerns that are, business just going to offset and do what they do and, offset stuff? Or is it really that turning point when investors are asking the question, which I think is probably going to be the most effective way to really transform our industry, to think, well, how do we truly build the infrastructure we need in ways that enhance nature? Because I think that investor lens is really interesting. But where do you see this heading? Because it feels like a tipping point.
Yeah, I agree. I think that business resilience is what's going to be driving conversations much more in the next few years. So
Right.
we have typically, thought of nature as a separate entity, and we're kind of addressing our impacts, yes. And, that could be through a CSR driven approach, or it could be kind of with compliance markets, for example, where it's just a kind of license to operate situation. But really, I think businesses and the private sector in general is starting to realize just how much is on the hook for them personally,
Yeah.
for their organizations, if they don't get on top of things like drought risk and flood risk and, supply chain volatility, all driven by these massive nature shocks that could come along and really destabilize the global economy. And we did a piece of work earlier this year that quantified the nature-related risks to the UK economy. And it was really, really fascinating. And it was, the modelling done was so brilliant that I think there's value in expanding that internationally and kind of bringing everyone along on that journey through a risk lens.
Yeah, but it's risk to the business, isn't it?
Risk to the business, exactly.
And I think that there's such a bridge between, so Biodiversity Net Gain, we were talking about this yesterday actually, it's so physical. You've got a woodland, can you enhance it? Can you reduce your impacts on it? And then building created habitats. But it's so physical. Where you're talking is where we need to be, is what are the business risks from nature? How do people start answering that question?
Well, I think there's resources out there, especially, kind of assessment frameworks and disclosure frameworks like the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures.
Yes.
That takes a very specific, there's, a very specific approach called the LEAP approach, where you're actually looking at your location and evaluating and assessing and preparing. That's what LEAP stands for. To think, okay, really look at where your operations are based. Because, for example, carbon is a global polluter. It kind of floats up into the atmosphere and people think, oh, we've got to kind of do what we have to do to bring the overall level down. Let's buy offsets and let's decarbonize and do all that kind of stuff. But with nature, it's so location specific. So you really do need to take a landscape view of what the risks are and how the catchment and the wider region is faring and kind of what opportunities are out there to address that. And that's both within the business and with local stakeholders like landowners that could potentially provide services for addressing those risks. I think what we are also missing is potentially nature positive pathways for sectors.
Yeah.
So I think, you could be a business and you could go through the TNFD and assess your risks and produce a report. I think there are 11 reports out there in the UK right now from the early adopters, and we're doing an assessment on that, which is going to be published soon. But we have, it's really tough if you as a business have created your model and your supply chain and your infrastructure, and you realize that actually you've got huge risks and huge impacts and you need to address it. But then you think, oh my gosh, what do I need to do? I need to do something. I'm not sure. And I think sectors working together.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But then we had COVID. Businesses are good if they want to.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think you're right. I think it's what is nature. But if you just think about it from a risk lens, that's what businesses do. They're incredibly good at understanding their business risks.
Yeah, exactly. But nature as a risk is something that we've just not developed as much of an understanding about. And so developing those sector-specific pathways to address those is going to be quite key. So
I think your work in terms of, what's coming out in terms of companies following TNFD as well, that all just helps that understanding.
Yeah, it all builds to this bigger systemic picture of how do we reduce our impacts and I think we're always going to be, always going to be dependent, but how do we address our impacts and dependencies on nature?
Is there anything important that we have not yet discussed?
I think that, it's also important for global leaders to lead by example in terms of you have this private sector and so much firepower behind it, but you also, have other policy tools like subsidies, like tax, general things. And I think there's a lot of pressure on the private sector to get moving, but I would also like to see countries kind of
so true,
shift their policy incentives accordingly.
Yeah, governments.
Yeah.
Reporting their nature impacts.
Exactly. Bringing in philanthropic capital as well, and crowding, using combinations of blended finance, because, if you're talking about investing in nature, that can be, very tough to kind of meet that 12% return or whatever your shareholders want from you. So how can finance work with philanthropic capital to kind of de-risk that?
Coming back to what we talked about, so this is the rise of nature. But one moment I'll be really excited, but one moment I'll worry that we're not going to truly make this point.
Yeah.
What is your greatest fear when it comes to what feels like this tipping point? It feels like this is moment now for nature. But if we don't get it right, what do you really worry about that?
I worry about this idea that everyone's going to think it's someone else's problem to fix. I think people are going to wonder, why are we putting in so much effort? I think, trust these governments to sort it out, or trust these private sector entities that have announced massive, massive targets for channeling private finance into nature. I think we all need to be vigilant, and we all need to make sure that the direction of travel is going to be focused on actual action, and not kind of
and collective action.
Collective action, exactly. It's everyone's responsibility. But I don't want to see people assume that,
someone else is going
to fix it. Yeah.
And I think your work is, especially the roadmap, I found it really inspiring. But who is your role model?
Really tough one. I think I've got a mix of people, really. But I have to say a classic one would be Jane Goodall. I think that's completely, not related to the finance aspect as much, but she is just such an inspiration. She started...
Icon.
She's an icon, but the more you she's a household name. The more you learn about her, the more you're impressed by her. And so she didn't have a formal scientific training. She just sort of,
she learned
on the job, and she took unorthodox methods that a lot of people criticized her for, but she completely changed our understanding of how, chimpanzees and people are not so different. And then she is an activist, but she actually focuses so much on hope. And I think in this sector in particular, it's so easy to get disheartened.
Yeah, that's so true.
But she is, you read her books and you kind of watch her speak, and she's getting involved in kind of policy and
she always has that message of hope. That's so true.
And I think it's really, really good to kind of make sure that you as an individual in this space take a step back and let yourself be.
What I learned from Jane Goodall is, and I've been privileged to be one of her lecturers, not everyone can communicate that level of science or what she saw, and it's that kind of communication piece and the way that she really inspires. You're right. Just the way that she acts, but also the way that she was able to communicate and get people to, really join her mission.
Yeah, definitely. No, it was unbelievable.
And last question for people who are just starting out and they're thinking, yes, I want to join the mission. I want to work and do what I can for nature within our industry world. What's your advice?
I would say there is no shortage of good to do and work to be getting on with. So you can almost give yourself permission to be selective and really find what drives you as an individual. There's going to be something that you think is amazing and really kind of interests you on an intellectual level, as well as a kind of a professional level and a spiritual level. You can speak to, there's so much stuff that, I can see people being drawn to one particular issue, and that is their drive, that is their food for the soul.
Yeah.
In particular, when we get, disheartened and there's a lot of bad news going around, having a cause or a concept or, anything that you really back in your heart and soul to fall back on when those times are tough, that's going to be hugely important. So nature, I know we've gone from green finance to sustainability and then to nature in particular. But there's within those areas, you can work on one single thing, one tiny part of it for the rest of your life. But if that's what drives you, then do it.
Phoebe, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you.